More than 20 years have passed since the day that Len Bias died. Bias was a University of Maryland student, but not just any student. He was a blue-chip star basketball player who had been picked in the first round by the Boston Celtics. Less than 48 hours after he was drafted, he died from a cocaine overdose. Today, there are hundreds of stories in the newspaper about Len Bias. Stories of lost promise, of what might have been, and of basketball and the individuals who have been influenced by the Len Bias legend. But few even touch on the real story. The fact that Len Bias' death triggered a near genocidal attack on the African American community in the United States. Or at the very least, the systematic disenfranchisement of the African American males. Surprised? Even skeptical? Listen in and tell me what you think. Here's a quote from Len Bias' mother, Lonis Bias. Many people have come to me throughout the last 20 years and have told me that the day Len died was the day they stopped using cocaine. I've had people stop me in the street and tell me that. To this day, they still do, telling me they've remained clean since that time, and it was a very important turning point in their lives. End quote. And that's a valid point of discussion on the anniversary of his death, and certainly one to help a mother realize that some good has come out of her son's death. But the other story is less positive and involves political gain, race, and a drug war out of control. And for that, we need to step back and see what happened in the political arena immediately following Len Bias' death. We start with Dan Baum's excellent book, Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs and the Politics of Failure. Page 22. Immediately upon returning from the July 4th recess, Tip O'Neill called an emergency meeting of the crime-related committee chairman. "Write me some goddamn legislation," he thundered. "All anybody up in Boston is talking about is Len Bias. The papers are screaming for blood. We need to get out in front of this right now, this week, today. The Republicans beat us to it in 1984, and I don't want it to happen to us again. I want dramatic new initiatives for dealing with crack cocaine and other drugs. If we can do this fast enough," he said, "the Republican leadership will be gone. We can take the issue away from the White House." End quote. In life, Len Bias was a terrific basketball player. In death, he became the Archduke Ferdinand of the quote-unquote war on drugs. What came before had only been skirmishing. The real drug war had yet to begin. Within weeks, the country would be marching with their bayonets fixed and picket lines consisting in the hundreds. The result was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, complete with mandatory minimums, asset forfeiture, and loads of drug war goodies. So what happened as a result of this new mandatory minimum sentencing? Well, within a few years, it appeared that blacks were being disproportionately sentenced for the crack cocaine offenses as well as other minorities. Congress called upon the U.S. Sentencing Commission to study the impact of the mandatory minimum sentences. The commission found the disparity in sentencing harshness between white and black offenders had increased. Congress and the administration did nothing to address this problem. Nothing. By 1995, no white person had been prosecuted in the federal court under the 1986 crack mandatory minimums in Los Angeles and every other major metropolitan city, although hundreds of blacks had been. Another study by the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 1995 found the 100-to-1 powder cocaine crack variation seemed to have individual impact on black offenders. For example, 88% of the mandatory crack sentences were imposed on blacks in 1993. The commission recommended changes in the guidelines. But for the first time, Congress voted to disapprove the Commission's proposed amendments to the sentencing guidelines. So what's the 100-to-1 threshold disparity about? It takes 1/100th of the amount of crack to trigger the same mandatory minimum as powder cocaine. Remember, when Len Bias died in 1986, cocaine, it was 98% pure. Unheard of at the time. So here's some stats. Back in 1986, the year that Len died, white and African American drug offenders represented similar proportions of all those sent to prison in the state. 17% African American, 15% white. But by 1999, nearly half, or about 47% of all African American prisoners in Maryland were for drug offenses, when compared to only 21% for whites. African Americans are 28% of the general population now, and 68% of all people arrested for drug offenses in Maryland, and 90% of the people in prison in the state for basic drug offenses. The increase in African American admissions to prisons for drug offenses was 18 times greater than the increase in white drug offenders admissions between 1986 and 99. African American admissions for drug offenses represented close to 94% of growth of the state's use of prison for drug offenses only. The African American rate of drug prisoner admissions per about 100,000 citizens grew 8 times the rate of young people in general. Between 86 and 1999, African American youth represented a total of 96% of the new youth prison admissions for the drug offenses. Ridiculous if you ask me. And of course, this wasn't just in Maryland. The movement toward increased incarceration in general and increasingly racial disparity was happening across the country. The government to this day has failed to address any meaningful reform to the Len Bias legacy, so the problem will more than likely continue and get worse. The fact that this sentencing disparity has not yet been corrected by Congress is a powerful racist stain on our government, or institutional racism. And there has been disturbing lack of leadership in this area by black politicians, combined with racist co-opting of the black community by our quote-unquote drug warriors or special task forces. Now, certainly more than ever, every aspect of the story cannot be specifically attributed to Len Bias, and the results can hardly be considered it's Len's fault. However, it's clear that Len Bias's death served as a major catalyst for political activity that resulted in laws as powerful, damaging, and racially disparate in effect. But this is a powerful reminder of what can happen when you combine hysterical media coverage with selfish politicians. Now, there is a bit of rather perverse poetic justice in the story, if you connect all the dots. Take the Democrats. In their rush to outdo the Republicans in being tough on drugs, they helped create a system that disenfranchised a group that traditionally voted Democratic. In a large part because of the war on drugs and its mandatory minimums, 1 in 4 black men in Florida were not allowed to vote. So during an election year, this state will more than likely lean toward Republicans, without all the votes they should have received that would have been Democratic. Now remember back during the 2000 presidential elections in Florida, being the key state determining the amount of votes to the winner between Al Gore and George Bush? If the Democrats hadn't been in such a rush to look as tough on drugs as the Republicans were back in '86, Florida wouldn't have become a blue state, and George Bush would never have became president in 2000. Kind of like shooting yourself in your foot, you think?
Daydream, I fell asleep amid the flowers for a couple of hours on a beautiful day.